Hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, I'm a programmer at TIFF now, and this is the other thing I do. My guest this week is Joseph Amenta, a film teacher and filmmaker whose terrific first feature, Soft, about three queer kids whose friendship is tested over one pivotal summer in Toronto, was one of my favorite Canadian films at TIFF last year. It kicks off its Canadian theatrical run right here at home at the Revue Cinema this Friday, April 7th, and then opens in Winnipeg April 14th, in Calgary April 21st, and in Saskatoon on May 19th, with more bookings sure to come. You should see it. Joseph picked Tangerine, Sean Baker's 2015 breakout drama starring Kitana Kiki Rodriguez and Maya Taylor as Cinderella and Alexandra, two trans sex workers spending Christmas Eve in West Hollywood trying to figure out whether Cindy's boyfriend, who's also her pimp, has been cheating on her while she was locked up for 28 days. But that's not what the movie's really about. Tangerine pays attention to every detail of the lives of its characters and the world they live in, just so we can see them. Baker had been making movies for 15 years already, but this was the one where he figured out what he does best. And people noticed. This is Someone Else's Movie.
I distinctly remember watching Tangerine for the first time as an experience that, was a first in cinema for me. It was a small theater at the Carlton Cinemas, and it was a recommendation. And I sat in this theater with maybe 3 or 4 other people. It was a small room. And I was just taken by it. I was taken by how rough it was. I was taken by the journey. I was taken by the stilted performances and the energy. And I found that it was teaching me the language that it was creating through its world, through its characters. And it made me resist the urge to make judgments about it very quickly, very, very quickly. And I found myself just in love with the characters and the small moments that it was presenting by the end of it. It really impacted the way I created work from then on.
It's funny, I've had a conversation very similar about Harmony Korine's Gummo with Ian Carpenter, who said he just walked into it and was hit in the face with it and discovered it. And there was another movie that he saw at the Carlton, Blue Velvet, years earlier that did the same thing. That films that taught him how to watch them and how to speak the language that they were speaking. And it's fresh in my mind. And it's just, Tangerine does that too. I hadn't even thought about it in those terms.
I think that it starts off presenting, even from the medium it's being shot on with the iPhone, and those kind of vibrant, overly exposed colors. It feels like you're watching something that almost doesn't belong in a cinema. And your body is fighting it. There's pretension in all of us that's fighting this presentation of kind of, again, a little bit campy performances, kind of a bombastic presentation, even the conversation that the film opens with. And you find yourself kind of creating a judgment of it. And I think it does that on purpose. It wants you to create that judgment so that it can slowly but surely dismantle it and make you fall in love with these two characters that you're on a journey with.
Yeah, Baker, I hadn't thought about the gatekeeper analogy, but it's making us the gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. And then I realized, of course, that all of Baker's movies are about this.
Yes.
He's drawn towards not just outsiders and the fringes of what's conceived of as, I suppose, like middle-class society, which is really just anyone with any kind of stability.
Yeah.
And his loyalties are always with people who are on the verge of absolute collapse. Yes. Homelessness, poverty, destitution, violence, over and over and over again. I'm still not sure how I feel about Red Rocket.
I haven't seen it. I have not seen it.
It's a movie that challenges your sympathies
I appreciate
from
that,
the jump. Yeah.
But I appreciate that. I love an anti-hero because I feel like we were used to seeing anti-heroes in very specific bodies. And I'm actually developing a story right now that challenges this. Okay. We're used to seeing an anti-hero in very specific bodies because we're comfortable if that body is someone of power, someone of status, and they flip the switch on the audience. But when it comes from maybe a vulnerable body or, a morally complex place, where we are used to looking at those people with empathy and sympathy and maybe idealizing or tokenizing groups of people. When they present nuance with an action or a moral gray area, I think that, it really creates a tantalizing experience for me as a viewer. It really pushes diverse voices into a space of true authenticity, displaying the human condition on camera and not just using people as a device or a guilt complex. And I love that.
Ever since since I first saw the film in 2015, I was aware that it was a movie about trans sex workers, right? Like there's nothing, it's not hiding anything about that. But watching it again, I was really surprised to see how unambiguously the movie puts us in their world. There's no illusions. These characters know exactly who they are, and there's no fronting, there's no pretense.
No training wheels.
Yeah, and it's up to us to keep up. And I was really surprised at how assured and confident that is, right? Because the movie does, as you say, it looks like it wasn't made by professional hands. It's not amateurish exactly, but when you say you shot your movie with 3 iPhones, you immediately are putting out the image of, we just made this, like it just happened. And I think that's a great way of adjusting our brains to the reality that we're seeing, which is a fictional construction of reality. But in the same way, the Florida Project sort of plays with Disneyland and all the things that are and aren't real. That in that film, when Willem Dafoe shows up, it's jarring.
Yes. There's an immersion that Sean Baker is obsessed with, I think, as an artist, by placing the audience and even himself as a creator into that world so holistically, without those training wheels, without needing to baby or teach the audience step by step. And I think when we're engaging with sex work, specifically in the queer community, which is very, very common, extremely common, and undiscussed outside of perhaps trans experience, because they're the most fetishized, I would say, within the community. There's a sense of kind of casual action that I think most audiences would feel uncomfortable with, that I think a lot of queer people who watch that film are able to relate to or find humor in. I think that when we think about sex work within the trans community, it's often coming from a place of violence or trauma or desperation. And the reality is, queer and trans people are valued sexually in the shadows. And, in West Hollywood, where the film takes place, they have realized the power that they hold within that community. And they manipulate that power when they need to. And they engage with each other openly and honestly, and they inject each moment with humor and ferocity. And I think that that's why I was drawn to it. It doesn't try to create a sob story. The film does not revolve around, an outside force creating trauma. It's the inner workings within that ecosystem that they've created.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It feels like it was being made now. It feels like we are in this place right now culturally where this film would just emerge and instantly be of the moment. And it's 7 years old, or 8 years old now, which I find absolutely shocking.
Yeah.
That it doesn't, other than the phones they're using, it really hasn't aged a day. And it's kind of remarkable that Baker was talking about those issues with those characters and letting them exist and inform the narrative the way they do, because he works very closely with his actors to shape the story. In 2015, before any of this stuff was, controversial, it was just demi-monde at the time, right?
Yeah. And I also think that the decision to shoot it on an iPhone, I almost think about video games with 8-bit or as a 16-bit. I think they upgrade. But those kind of stylistic elements of it being shot on an iPhone almost make the film feel less aged when you watch it now than if it was shot in the modern way of that time. It just feels rough, gritty, and individual. And the energy from the music to the kind of visceral nature of the imagery just captured me. I also just cackled the entire time. It's funny. It's funny. It's witty. It's catty. It's innately feminine. it's just a great adventure to engage with as an audience member.
Do you use it in teaching? Do you use it as a tool, way of communication? Like how do people respond to it now, I guess is my question, now that it is sort of its own established thing?
Well, I think when a film impacts me in the complicated way that this film impacted me, which I'm still trying to discover, I'm still trying to understand exactly what the magic was. I don't think I can completely put my finger on it. I reserve it to my own works, being an inspiration for my own works. Watching a moment and realizing why it's moved me so. Or understanding why a stilted performance, from a non-actor was so capable of creating this emotional journey for me. Because when you start watching the film, there are line reads or moments in the first 5-10 minutes where I'm like, "Ooh, is this the best take? Ooh, is this performance?" But that's not the goal of the film. And I think the relevance of watching people on screen fumble or say things that feel less curated or imperfect innately just allow for you as an audience member to realize that this film is going to be rough and ready. And that's something I try to instill into the students I teach. Having a strong concept and vision is more important than having a perfect image or the most curated narrative. And I think that the ragtag nature of this film is timeless and almost impossible to recapture.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. It's, it speaks to a more innocent moment too in American culture, just before Trump, just before sort of the legitimization of hate and how open bigotry was suddenly cool again, as it hadn't been since maybe the 60s. It's always been there. There's always been tension, and the self-loathing that comes out when people just sort of unleash their true selves always just feels so ugly to me. And the film is it's ultimately, I think it's the most optimistic film he's made.
I would agree with that. I mean, from what I've seen of his work, there's just something so celebratory about the simple journey of these two women surviving and thriving and laughing and seeking more from life. One of my favorite moments from the film, when she's promoting this show and we get to the bar and it's an unlikely crowd, very sparse, and we get to share a moment almost in complete silence of this woman singing, not superbly, but singing. And we see that these characters, like many of us, are seeking more, just something beyond survival. And she may not have a large audience. I mean, I can relate to this, but she has an audience and she's doing what she wants to be doing. And there's hope for more, which is exciting to watch as a viewer, especially through the lens of these two characters specifically.
Yeah, I know that the casting was revolutionary for the time, because Baker had just basically set out an open call for trans performers. And again, that's the kind of thing that could go terribly, terribly wrong right now. If you heard about this, there'd be protesters if it broke in the wrong way in the news media.
Yes.
And the idea that this thing could just happen quietly, and also because at the time Sean Baker wasn't Sean Baker, nobody knew who he was. He could work in relative obscurity. And then to find these two, Rodriguez and Taylor, who are just so alive and so comfortable. I have this whole pet theory about the generation of people who came of age with iPhones around, with camera phones around, and who are just so completely comfortable as themselves in front of cameras.
Yes.
It's going to get even worse with the generation of kids who's growing up now with TikTok and everything, constant exposure. And this is where I sound like a grumpy old man. But they are so natural. For people who have never acted before and who are playing characters, right? This is not just being yourself, but the negotiation. And I suppose there's an argument about, not an argument, but there's a whole backstory of being comfortable in a persona in terms of drag and trans and all of these things, where you become the person you're supposed to be. And David Cronenberg was just, have you seen this thing? It was on Twitter. It's just surfaced today. There's a quote from David Cronenberg about how It's a fairly recent interview because it's a conversation with somebody about Crimes of the Future. And the interviewer asks him if, when I was watching Crimes and noticing its themes about the evolution and transformation of the human body, I was wondering if you were engaging at all in ongoing conversations about the transgender movement. And his response was, they're taking that idea seriously. They're saying body is reality. I want to change my reality. That means I have to change my body. And they're being very brave and they're investing a lot in these changes, especially these ones that are not reversible, which most of them aren't. I say, go ahead. This is an artist giving their all to their art. And that's Tangerine, incredibly enough.
I mean, I think that it's interesting when we analyze these characters, how these two extremely tenacious and powerful and strong women are living on the fringes of society, and they are among the most brave in our society. They're treading against the current, and there is something so innately interesting about that. I mean, it relates to my own work, this idea that trans women, specifically trans women of color, have always been benchmarks, keystones within the community, because they've had to fight the hardest and they've had to be able to endure the most. And ultimately it's to attain an existence that I think a lot of audience members or viewers of the film will say, oh, all of this so that you could live like that. But for them, it's an existence of authenticity, and it's an ability to be themselves and hold power and take up space. And find friendships that feel authentic, which I think is really, really special. I mean, I think that you mentioned something really interesting by saying that Sean Baker making this film now would be engaging in a lot of backlash, which I think is true. I mean, I even had to bunker down for kind of the mosaic of racial identities and gender experiences within my own work, even being from the community. But I think that there is a really interesting discussion there about who is creating the resistance for this work, and whether or not the people who are engaging willingly so in the creation of it and taking part in it have the authority to decide for themselves whether or not they want to be involved in this story. And I think ultimately, when we're talking about depictions in cinema, a lot of people would look at this film and say, it's engaging with sex workers and trans bodies, and it's perpetuating a stereotype. And I hate that so innately, because, there is a large amount of trans people who do not engage in sex work, who have, found experiences outside of that. But there's also a large population of trans women who have not. And to erase that demographic from our recorded history because we're trying to seek a representation that is palatable or innately seen as positive to kind of heteronormative or mainstream audiences really irks me. It really, really irks me. We are colorful freaks and geeks of the world, and we engage in sex in all kinds of freaky deaky ways. And I don't think that we should shy away from that in the hopes of appearing more palatable to anyone.
Yeah, I've never understood the idea of a palatable stereotype, right? Like the idea that there is some middle ground that you can reach that pleases everyone, or at least makes things inoffensive. Someone will always be offended by literally anything in the world. And it is, I love people who come up with the examples of, well, there's this thing that bothers me. And it's a thing that simply doesn't exist. It's just a thing they're ready to be offended by.
Yes. It's having a lot of opinions about topics that they are ill-informed of.
And have no influence over, or no contact. Like, it doesn't change your life that these things that you've made up are in your head. I mean, I suppose it does actually. It's gotta be crippling. It's gotta be a horrible way to live in the world, and always be on the lookout for the next perceived slight to whatever your dominant point of view is. Whereas, I mean, yes, Sean Baker is a white guy with a camera. That is something you can't get away from. But where he chooses to point that camera, and the people he wants to help him, the people whose stories he wants to tell, and whose lives become part of the art that he's making, those things are also his choice, right? Like he's choosing to engage with these other social circles and gender circles. I don't even know what the terms are anymore for what he's doing.
There's an immersion there. It doesn't feel, I think that if we were to watch it and it felt surface level, we would be able to know that. I mean, I think people are able to engage with media and understand when something is of quality, researched, done correctly, and when things are not. So, I think that understanding context, of the situation specifically is very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that this is a theme of many of his works. He had a film called Prince on Broadway, or Prince of Broadway, and that was an earlier film that focused on the Black community in New York. And there's always been an interest in this man to kind of seek these perhaps lower income characters and dive, really deep into their world. And I don't think that he should be chastised for that. I think that we need to respect the people who are engaging in that storytelling process and realize that it's their decision to make, and that they have the capability to decide whether or not someone is authentic and well-intentioned or not.
Yeah, he's been at this for 20 years. If he was a tourist, we'd know by now. Right? Like he would have gone on to direct a Marvel movie or something, some horrible betrayal of his ethic. But he does seem to be inviting people in rather than framing them as subjects. And I think that's where Tangerine's power comes from, because it's not that he allows them their humanity. That's condescending. The idea that, you make a movie to show the world this culture. No, he's just there. The humanity is established and accepted. And we're just going to watch the story play out because it's a story that's worth telling. And it's characters who are interesting and worth following. And the trans aspect, other characters comment on it, right? Like there's the cab driver who has his own fetish, and he is seen in the film as a sort of an outsider for his predilections, rather than preying on trans characters, which is how like a more comfortable movie might frame it.
Absolutely.
And I love the idea that the movie doesn't care if I am on board, because it's going to tell it's like bigger, and these characters are the story. His point of view is the story, but the characters are the reason the film has the point of view. I don't feel like he's imposing any considerations or stereotypes on them. And people who come out thinking, oh, that movie was just about trans characters, I don't know why they'd make it. It's like, well, it's because they're who they are, not because of what they are.
The film is moving forward regardless of whether or not you're on board. And it's playing with themes and ideas that could be innately comfortable to certain audience members, and to others, it could be seen as humorous or heartwarming. I mean, when I watch that film, the language that they're speaking is not new to me. The kind of crass comments about sex, or this idea of being fetishized by cab drivers. I mean, these are like age-old themes in our world, and I love the nuance of having this man, this kind of secondary story, intertwined with a family, with a wife, and you see the ripple effect of not only the obstacles of being trans in the world, but also just like wanting to love a trans woman, being able to openly appreciate and seek partnership with a trans woman. I think that's where the comment is. It's this idea where, we're not making a comment that all trans women are sex workers, but we're talking about why society is so adamant about pushing them in that direction, because we're not able to see them as healthy, holistic, sexual partners.
Hey, it's Norm, interrupting my own show to bring you up to speed on Shiny Things, my twice-weekly newsletter about physical media, culture, and the odd streaming thing. Last week, I wrote about Shout Factory's new 4K restoration of The Exorcist 3, Paramount's Blu-ray release of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and how new editions of John Frankenheimer's Black Sunday and Matthew Robbins' Dragon Slayer open a window into studio blockbuster culture of the past. Sign up for a 14-day free trial at shiny-things.ghost.io, or find a link at the Simcast Twitter account. Look, this is what I do. I write about movies. Come check it out. And of course, Hollywood being the location where everything is for consumption, where every
Yes.
person goes to be assimilated or destroyed. I mean, in the other traditional arc of these stories, you expect that this is either a story about a rise or a fall because of his
Mm,
choice of location. And I think it's also really important that in Red Rocket, a character has come back from Hollywood to
mm.
his small town, and the films almost sort of work in concert. The guy in Red Rocket couldn't hack it and came home. And here you have survivors. Like the
Mm,
film ends on an on a such a subtle but but
I love
impactful.
it.
I hate
I
the word
love it.
impactful, but it just lands like a fist to the chest. That little
I love the
gesture of
last
the wig,
moment.
it's
Oh my
just
God.
so
Stop,
beautiful.
stop. You know what? That's really when the film got me. You know, I think that there were moments in the last bits of the film where I'm like, okay, the conflict feels like it's moving forward for the sake of perhaps a narrative moment. I'm
Mm.
not understanding the full intention of why, you know, she would have slept with her boyfriend and all of these kind of moments that I was ready to judge. And then I realized that the payoff was just a simple gesture of handing over a wig, you know, a peace offering, this idea of something being so incredibly vulnerable for a character to have to give up, but her love or her friendship or her willingness to apologize was so strong that that last shot in that laundromat is just so beautiful to me. It's the most beautiful frame.
Yeah, when I was thinking about it the first time, it's just like that's sisterhood, which of
Yes.
course is the entire argument of the film encapsulated in this tiny little moment where it would be it glimpsed from the outside, it's meaningless,
Mm,
but because we've spent an hour and a
yes.
half watching
It's
the two of
earned.
them, it's not just earned, it's the apotheosis
Mm,
of their relationship
yeah.
expressed instantly, wordlessly,
Yeah.
and almost,
Wordlessly.
yeah, almost matter of factly too, which is so great. It's a transferring of identity. There's so many things that you can interpret in there, and all it is the gesture of support.
Yes.
But it's beautiful.
And life goes on. Like there's no pretty bow, you know, it gives you this understanding of a moment of peace, reflection, and love before life continues. And they have to continue moving forward in some context. But there's a reassured idea that they have one another, you know, and that you're feeling solid within that fact, letting them go.
Yeah. And in another way, too, it's a process film because it shows us everything that is involved in their existence. Right? You
Mm,
see, it's simply about the reality of being a sex worker and a trans sex worker in Hollywood in 2015. But the sort of tourism aspect of it, where
mm.
we are tagging along with them through every aspect of their world.
Yes, they're our guide.
Yeah. And we see just what it means to have someone be that close to you and have and give yourself the space to trust them in
Yeah.
that last shot. And it's again, it's like an uphill climb to get there, but it's so good when they arrive.
I mean, even beyond just, you know, them trying to survive and engaging in sex work, it's like it's also the story of an aspiring singer and
Mm-hmm.
performer. It's the story of a woman who is innately ready to fight for what she wants and wants to be loved and accepted and be given a partner that respects that. You know, it feels like there's so many elements that inform the way we watch the film, but the root of it is actually very simple. And that kind of simple storytelling is really poignant when it's done well.
It's the recognizability of the structure, I think, that makes it
Mm,
that allows us to think we know where it's going at every turn, and then Baker just refuses to deliver the expected. He still gets us to a happy ending, which I
mm,
think is wonderful. And he's not an unconventional storyteller, but he chooses unconventional stories. And so I think that's the tightrope he walks. And in Red Rocket, I don't know that he stays on the wire quite so consistently, but this and the Florida Project are these little perfect bubble universes he constructs, and you can
yeah.
lose yourself for an hour and a half and then emerge changed.
I think that the world building in his work in this film in general is just it feels quite exceptional. It feels like we're falling down a rabbit hole, you know, into another world. And I think that the setting, you know, being in LA feels so perfect for it because we're surrounded by fabrication and illusion and fantasy, and we're falling down that rabbit hole with these two guides. I mean, there's something beautiful about a film that's able to show recognizable obstacles for characters that we feel we know, while also not making that the focus. You know, at the end of the film, when she gets thrown with urine, urine all over her by a passerby, that's something that we're used to seeing for these demographics, but it's a small element that creates a bigger moment. Right. It's a piece of the puzzle to honor those obstacles without making them a focal point, because the film is not about that. The film is not about them. The film is about these two women.
Yeah, and she immediately shakes it off too.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a lasting trauma. It's either happened enough times that it doesn't have any effect, or it's still just a glancing speed bump on her way to the end point, to achieving her vision of success, whatever that will be. Yeah. And it sets up, as you say, it sets up that beautiful moment that is purely necessity, right? Like, it's driven by circumstance, and it won't be the only moment of connection between them, but it's where we choose to go, or it's where the film chooses to leave them. And so that gives you a sense of hope and a sense of optimism that things will work out. And then you have, the world that it was released into versus the world that we're living in now, where again, like, this would be revelatory now, even now, to an audience, which is kind of depressing.
I think so. You know what the thing is? It's like even now, like not a lot of people have seen this film, and especially outside of the kind of film industry or zeitgeist, and that really trickles down to the queer population. I mentioned this film to any queer person I meet at a party when we're talking about cinema, and it just doesn't breach that barrier. So challenging to breach, kind of casual queer audiences engaging with work that really can speak to us. And I'm not from West Hollywood. I'm not a trans woman, but there's a language and a culture that's being displayed here, with the music, with the energy, with the lingo, with the cattiness and the kind of femme expression that feels innately powerful. I mean, these women are tearing the city up. They're tearing it up. And when she grabs the other girl by the hair and just, I don't know, there's just something that feels so interesting to me when we're seeing characters exert that power and take up that space. It just feels humorous and engaging, especially for a protagonist, a set of protagonists that feel like they're walking a line of moral ambiguity sometimes, and they're playing with fire, and their needs are sometimes selfish, but we're on that journey with them. We want them to get what they want.
Oh yeah. We have a rooting interest by the like 15 minutes in.
Yes.
And so, okay, what do people say when you bring the movie up? Is it that they have an idea of it and that's why they haven't seen it, or have they simply not heard of it? They've
not heard of it. No, I think that I think that there's an assumption by a lot of people in my community that the work that we're going to see is maybe the one or two queer films that breach, the barriers and are standouts. Otherwise, there's a lot of lack of interest. I think we grew up watching cinema as a means of escape and disassociation, because we're watching, love stories, heteronormative love stories. And listen, I know how to find my way into a story because I've had to do it so much. So I still get, emotionally moved by those stories. I think that there is just the assumption that work like this is not being created. And if it's being created, it's Love, Simon, or it's Moonlight. There's a range there that's kind of reaching that zeitgeist and kind of entering it. But the rest, those kind of auteur gems, are really challenging to engage with that audience.
Yeah, I don't know how you fix that.
Ultimately, I don't know if it's going to be fixed anytime soon. I think it's a smaller demographic too. I mean, it's about 10% of the population, and then within that, maybe 3 or 5% is really interested in this type of cinema. But I think, like, Paris is Burning has become a Bible for most of us, as recorded history amongst a million complications, I'm sure. But that has been able to kind of live in that queer zeitgeist. And I wish more cinema was able to kind of get in there, because we need more references. We need more cinema like this that is living in our memories and our thoughts. We need more. We need more adventures that are reflective of us. I watch queer cinema and I feel defensive at first. I feel very critical and very defensive because I'm not used to being seen like that. It's almost uncomfortable, if I'm being honest. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask about that. There is this sense now that people, a lot of the, how can I put this? In the last couple of years, there's definitely been a turn in film writing and modern criticism where depiction is now equivalent to endorsement in film readings, which is absolute bullshit. And the other thing is that if a film doesn't reflect the critic's exact experience, even by 5%, the whole thing is somehow invalid, which seems to me to work against the whole concept of cinema as an empathy machine, right? Like
absolutely.
The way you posited, we watch these things to feel other feelings for other people with other people. And I don't know how we get out of that, because this narcissism, which again somehow feels linked to Trump, right? Like the embrace of, and Boris Johnson and all the other stuff, like the only way to exist now is to tell people how great you are and how stupid everyone else is. And that disallows the possibility of other people existing at your level. And so why would you ever plug into a story that isn't about you?
And I think that we even see that in a lot of filmmakers. I think that we're living in a society right now that is really critical about telling stories that are removed from your own. And that's creating a lot of filmmakers that are essentially creating autobiographical or memoir-based films. And I'm not really interested in that. I'm really interested in listening to the world as it lives and breathes around me. I'm similar to Sean Baker in the sense that I love being immersed into other realities and doing the work to find the story and the characters and demystifying the camera for its actors and performers, because I'm just bored. I'm bored of seeing the same handful of stories. And, not to be overtly specific, but I think that we're moving to a time where there's a very, again, digestible, accessible form of diverse, in quotes, storytelling. And if you breach beyond that, if you play too hard with your tools, you're going to be either criticized or disregarded. And that can be frustrating, certainly frustrating, when you're seeing the same groups of stories being told over and over and over again, because they're comfortable and because they are not going to be met with, overt criticism. Which is something that needs to change. Without us able to find stories outside of our own experiences, then fiction will cease to exist. And the film has to still be a place for fantasy. Sean Baker works with his actors to find the story, to morph the character, something that I've taken into my own work. But ultimately, there's a distance between those individuals and the characters that they're playing and the narrative that they're engaging in. And I think that there's a power in that. I think that there's a really big power in that. And we shouldn't shun him for wanting to discover that.
Nicely put. And I'm just trying to figure out how to link this to your film, because Soft feels very much like a conventional framework around a unique and specific story, where you're telling a story about three kids in the into the big city on a quest effectively in the first 5 minutes. And then you don't abandon it exactly, but that framework is our way into a story about people we wouldn't ordinarily see in movies, and characters and lives with complexity that often isn't afforded to such characters. Right down to, I don't want to spoil anything for people listening, but the slow revelation of the very different home lives of your three protagonists, which becomes the sort of locus on which the whole movie turns. Yeah,
I think what I wanted to create, and it's interesting how the film has been marketed in festivals and even now, it's a film about kids. It's a film about three friends who have found one another, who have a common experience or a common language, and they're being kids. They're discovering what sex is, what love is, what adventure is, what the city is, where they fit. and they're discovering all these things together, and they're trying to survive and thrive. But the film, exists in a queer space with queer characters, but it's marketed so heavily as a queer film. It's marketed so heavily as, a diverse cast. And all of these things need to be honored. But, at the core of the film, it's an adventure with these three children who are trying to find their place. And it's frustrating sometimes when that cannot be the foundation of how we're introducing these films, because when you start creating descriptive language that is a barrier to some audience members, it can limit the film's reach. It's really about me finding people who inspired me and the world that I live in, and wanting to amalgamate those things in cinema to create a narrative fictional film. Doesn't always need to just be a box checked or a quota fill. Like it's challenging because you want to talk about social topics when you're creating work like this, and it's important to do so. But I'm making a fictional film. And, the death of a character or the lives of a character or the narrative device of my work is so intrinsically linked to social politics. And there's such sensitivity around these lives because of the lack of information that the world understands about them, that, sometimes we forget that I'm not here to give you a PSA. Sometimes I'm just wanting to create an engaging narrative for the audience to feel something by the end of. That's it. It's a story.
Yeah, but it's a story that's going to persist, which is the thing that I think is important about your work and Baker's work. These movies will be here in 10 years or 20 years to show people what's possible. Mm-hmm. Like that there is, even if it's fictional, there is still a roadmap to something that's optimistic and positive and hopeful. And not necessarily for every character, but
yes,
for the protagonists that we're watching, for the people we're spending time with, those lives become instructive is maybe a word that I would use, and something, like aspirational.
Yeah. You know what? It's something that I've experienced mostly with queer audience members, where they come up to me and they say, I have a lot of complicated feelings, but I've never seen a depiction like that. Because it's showing children. And I think the discussion of transness and queerness with children, when they're not of age, it can be uncomfortable. And I think if I was to make this film, 10 years ago, it would be a completely different story. But it's again questioning this idea that transness and queerness are linked innately and only to sexual preference. It's always sexualized. It's always sexualized. And I knew I was different when I was, 7 years old. So I wasn't having sex. I wasn't discovering what that was yet, but I felt different. I had different mannerisms, different dress, different forms of communication. And I just wanted to show that. I wanted to show that without the characters needing to hide or conform, because they have strength in numbers. And we have a bit of an inside view, a perspective where we're able to follow that ride with them.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this at the premiere at TIFF in September. The thing that I immediately connected to is that they know who they are. They just don't know how the world works. And that's the more interesting conflict, right? We've seen coming out stories
a million
hundreds
times.
of times. Yeah,
I know. And it's always characters who are silenced or sheepish or made small in their environments. And, I look around my community on a night out and I'm like, there's nothing sheepish or small about us, baby. We are loud, we are colorful. And I wanted to see that ferocity in these young, very vulnerable bodies, because when you're young like that, you feel invincible. And we sometimes lose that in coming of age stories, or coming of age stories that are linked to coming out or transitioning. There's a very kind of fragile adult mentality that's placed onto the child that I feel is not authentic to the childhood experience.
Yeah, no, of course these kids are loud. How could they not be? They don't know not to be.
Yeah, exactly. So Yeah, I just wanted to discover what that was like, and I feel like we did that, which was rewarding.
Yeah. And I'm so happy it's out there for people to find.
Hmm. Likewise, it couldn't get out soon enough. I'm itching for it to be released fully. I just want people to get their eyes on it. For people who love it, for people who hate it, I just want it to exist at this point.
Yeah. I mean, you've been if taking the film to a festival is like giving birth, you've been sort of in the postpartum phase, I guess, for 6 months.
That's a beautiful way to describe the emotional roller coaster I've been feeling. Yes.
Well, time to get it out. Time to be done with the depression and move forward.
Yeah, exactly.
My thanks to Joseph Amenta, whose terrific first feature Soft opens in Toronto this Friday, April 7th at the Revue Cinema, and rolls on to Winnipeg April 14th, Calgary April 21st, and Saskatoon May 19th. You don't want to miss it. Thanks also to Angie Power. She knows what she did. Joey's not on Twitter, but you can follow their movie at Level Film, all one word, and you can find Tangerine on Blu-ray from Magnolia Pictures and streaming for free on Hoopla and Tubi in Canada and Hoopla and Canopy in the US. It's also available for rental and sale on various VOD platforms. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner, and you can find this podcast there at Semcast, S-E-M-Cast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. The first year of the show is still available for just $20 at payhip.com/Semcast. That's the first 52 episodes of Someone Else's Movie, 44 of which aren't currently available anywhere else. And check out my newsletter, Shiny Things, at shiny-things.ghost.io. I think you'll enjoy it. Our theme song is by The Last Year. If you like it, or the show in general, please say so. Leave a review wherever you've been listening. Every little bit helps, it truly does. And check out the other shows on the Frequency Podcast Network while you're doing that. Stay safe, watch movies, wear a mask if you go out, get your booster when you can. I'll see you next week.